I want to start off by planting two ideas in your head that I hope will help when we then get into this next episode of Matthew's Gospel. The first one is about the Son, and the second one is about the second commandment. I don't have points or anything today. It's not quite happened this week. But I'm hoping these two things will help kind of unfold this passage a little bit. So, do you remember what the Son is? Feels like we've not really seen it since October. But is anyone toiling with SAD this year? I feel like it's been quite hard the last couple of weeks. It's felt pretty dark. But let me tell you a little bit about the Sun, just to remind you what it is. It's a massive star. Apparently, I don't know this, but the internet told me, circumference 4 million kilometres. It's quite big. And at its core, it burns at a temperature of 15 million degrees Celsius. Apparently, it's so powerful that the energy that the Sun can emit in 1 second is greater than the energy that humanity has produced in the history of its existence. Apparently, in 1 second, the Sun emits the equivalent of 92 billion megaton nuclear bombs. Isn't that mad? 92 billion megaton nuclear bombs in a second. That's the Sun. Now, it's quite far away. Apparently, over 145 million kilometres. But even though it's so far away, every single thing on this planet, 145 million kilometres away, is dependent upon the light and the life of the Sun for their light and life. Without it, even us being so far away, we have absolutely nothing. Now, all I want you to hang on to at the start is that even though we are in this season of winter, where we've not seen the Sun in a while, everything that we have just said about the Sun has still been true. You get that? Even though we've not seen it, still hot, still burning, still powerful, still intense, still everything the Sun is, it is right now, even though we've not seen it in months. The season may hide it, but the Sun still shines. That's a little snapshot to grab, okay? Everyone got that picture? The season may hide it, but the Sun still shines. That's the Sun. The other thing I want to plant in your little head is about the second commandment. Now, later on, Moses is going to appear in this episode. And Moses was a man who lived about 1,300 years before Jesus was born at Christmas. And one of the things Moses receives on a mountain is God's 10 commandments. They are the rules that he gives to his rescued people. And the second commandment says this. Listen carefully. God says, "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." Now, what's God saying in that commandment? He's saying, when you worship me as God, you must not make any visual representation of me as God. And you shall not bow down and worship before any image of me. Now, there's numerous reasons why God might say that, but one of the most significant ones is that whenever you make an image of God, you are immediately limiting God. So as soon as you try and depict him as anything in creation, you are taking something away from him as the creator. That makes sense? He is too big for you to represent in something little. As someone who is infinite, he cannot be accurately defined or kind of displayed in something that is finite. Does that make sense? So if you were to make an image of God, it would not be an act of worship of God. In some way, it would warp God because it would be too small. Does that make sense? Now, for years, Christians have been wrestling with the commandments, particularly trying to be careful about how they apply. We do not want to disobey what God has said. We often use catechisms at Gracemount Community Church. We're going to use one later on. But one of the most famous catechisms is called the Westminster Larger Catechism. And these were some brainy people who sat down and tried to go, how do we make sure we keep this commandment? This is one of the questions they ask. What are the sins forbidden by the second commandment? And I'm going to read you a little bit of their answer. And I want it to mess with your head a little bit. Okay? Listen to their answer. So, how do we make sure we don't cross over the boundary of the second commandment? What are the sins forbidden? They say, the making of any representation of God, of all or of any of the three persons, either inwardly in our minds or outwardly in any kind of image or likeness of any creature whatsoever. Now you hear what they're saying? To make any image of God, and this is a bit you want to pick up on, of any or all three persons of God, Father, Son, or Holy Spirit. To make a visual representation of Father, Son, or Holy Spirit is to break the second commandment. Which means, I think what they're saying is, to represent Jesus and to depict him in any physical way is to break the second commandment. So, this is where I want to mess with your heads a little bit. And I'm not telling you yet whether or not I agree with them. But according to that logic, here's what this means. Any picture of Jesus on a Christmas card, any representation of Jesus in a nativity scene, any image of Jesus in a kid's Bible, a visual of Jesus in a movie or a TV show, any picture of Jesus from a stained glass window to a tattoo is a breaking of the second commandment. You having that? Interesting, isn't it? Now we're going to come back to that. But what they're saying is Jesus too is too big for you to make him small. He is too infinite for you to make him finite. It won't be an act of worship of him, it will warp him, to use that phrase. Now, they're the two things I want to keep in your head, and now we're going to read from Matthew chapter 17. The Son and the second commandment. Are you in the game before we blow the first kind of whistle? Yeah? Okay, Matthew 17, verse 1. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was, Jesus, was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Now we're going to stop there. This moment in the Bible, in the life of Jesus, is known as the transfiguration of Jesus. It's a big word, but it just means his figure was transformed in front of these three boys. When they had walked up the mountain with him, Jesus would have looked almost identical to the other three guys who were walking up the mountain. They would have been probably dark-skinned, dark-haired, Middle Eastern, working class, homeless guys whose clothes would have been pretty tattered and weathered. All four of them walking up the hill. But as soon as they hit the summit, Jesus shines. You see it? The language is, it's almost frightening. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as light. In this moment, from the lad's perspective, Jesus has changed. They had walked shoulder to shoulder up the mountain with him, but now they need to hide their eyes from him. He is glowing like the sun. You see that? Although, though, to them it looks like he has changed, the really important thing we need to realize today is Jesus has not actually changed. He's not. In this moment, Jesus is not morphing into something that he's not been before. In this moment, Jesus is simply showing his disciples who he has always been. This is who he is. Remember what we saw last week? He is not just the Son of Mary. He is the coming Son of Man. He always is, always has been this sun-like glory. Think about what we said about the sun. Even in this winter season, the sun is still being blazing hot, unbelievably intense, and the sustaining life force behind all of creation. The season may hide it, but the sun shines still. In this season, right, we've been reading through Matthew's Gospel. In this season of Jesus' life, for most of it, Jesus has looked like a run-of-the-mill Jewish punter. But what this season of his existence has concealed is that he is still the burning hot, powerful, sustaining life of God. That's been the secret. Remember, that's been the language Matthew's used. And at times, that secret has shot out shards of light in all those miracles. But at this point, at the top of this mountain, for these three boys, the secret shines. This is who he is. There's a beautiful moment. Peter writes a letter to Peter later on. And what he says is, we became eyewitnesses of his majesty. Jesus is not mere man. Jesus is majesty. We sang it in that first carol. Veiled in flesh, the Godhead see. The season may hide it, veiled in flesh, but what are you seeing? God the Son, blazing glory. Now think about the sun again. And let's go from winter to summer. Even in the midst of summer. So remember when Kobe, Jack and Cameron turned pink when they were, was it in Greece? Even when they were in Greece, the blazing intense heat of Greece, if a cloud came between them and the sun, what would they have felt? Shade. It would have instantly felt slightly cooler. Isn't that mad? The intensity of the sun can be shaded from us by something as immaterial as a cloud. That melts my head. There's something similar going on in the life of Jesus. This is verging on heresy. But I think what's going on is you have the intensity of the burning glory of God the Son veiled behind the thinness of human flesh. But here he illuminates that true identity. The skin hides it, but the sun shines still. I think that's the point. You with me? Now, let's keep reading. Matthew 17, verse 3. Just then, there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Now again, if you're new to the Bible, you might not know these 2 guys, Moses and Elijah. Let me tell you 3 very, very, very quick things about them. Moses and Elijah lived hundreds of years before Jesus, but they were both standout servants of God. Both of them, in some way, beheld God's glory on the top of a mountain. Okay, that's the first thing. Standout servants who had beheld God's glory. The second thing, importantly, both of their deaths were kind of shrouded in something supernatural. They'd become known as kind of deathless ones, along with one other guy in the Old Testament. The third thing you need to know is there was some expectation around them in Jewish history that they or people like them were going to come back. So actually, Moses and Elijah would have been less of a shock to the 3 disciples on the top of the mountain than Jesus shining like the sun. But Peter, being Peter, decides to speak up true to form. And he says, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you wish, I'll put up 3 shelters, one for you, Moses and Elijah. The heck is that all about? I don't think I've understood it, but as I've looked at it this week, I think it is another time when Peter spoke up when he should have shut up. I think what he says is very dangerous in 2 ways. The first one is, it shows that he has not learnt the lesson that Jesus taught him just a couple of episodes earlier. Do you remember that time that Jesus predicted he was going to go from Caesarea Philippi down to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem he was going to suffer? What did Peter say? He took Jesus aside. Lord, this shall never happen to you. And what did Jesus call him? Satan. I think even though Jesus has rebuked him, this is Peter doubling down on what he wants. And he is saying, Jesus, this is good here. This glory is good up here. Let's not go back down towards suffering. Let's camp out in this glory. Let's build houses. That's Peter doubling down in a very dangerous thing. Jesus is not staying up here. If Jesus stays up in glory, he is never going to be able to suffer to bring other people to eternal glory. Peter doesn't understand yet. The cross is still crucial. But here's the second big mistake that Peter makes. He treats Moses and Elijah in the same way that he treats Jesus. Notice what he says? How many shelters does he want to build? 3. 1 for Moses, 1 for Elijah, and 1 for Jesus. He says, right, let's get a wee cul-de-sac, top of a mountain, beautiful view, and you boys can just hang out. Now, what's the problem with that? Moses and Elijah are not Jesus. Moses and Elijah are not in the same category as Jesus. Moses and Elijah are not in the same league as Jesus, are they? They are not to be treated like Jesus. The whole point of them is they saw God's glory. Moses' face reflected God's glory for a moment. But they do not share God's sun-like glory. Jesus is not just another man. He is the Messiah. Jesus is not just another servant. He is God's Son. We're meant to look at the 3 men on the top of this mountain and go, he is shining like the sun. You don't treat him like anybody else. I think the point is, you're not meant to limit Jesus to being like them. You're not meant to lessen him and treat them the same as them. Come back to the Westminster Catechism, right? That thing, that if you make an image of Jesus, you're breaking the second commandment. What do you think? What's your instinct? Do you think they're right or they're wrong? Yeah.
Was it in connection with worshipping, though? Was there a connection there with
yeah, so I think there is a connection with worshipping, but I was chatting with Chris about this beforehand. I think the issue is also who has the right to depict God? And I think the answer is only God. In whatever way we depict him, we will in some way detract from him, and we are not in a position to say, I know who Jesus is in a way that I can accurately represent him on my own. Now, I don't know if they're right or not. I'm not convinced either way, but here's what I like about what they do. Their instinct is not to treat Jesus lightly. Their instinct is not to treat Jesus just like anyone else. Their instinct is not to lessen Jesus to a point where he is just another man. He's not. Draw Jesus casually, and you are probably treating him disrespectfully. You can draw Moses and Elijah all you want. You can draw beards on their face and whatever you want on their foreheads. You can do whatever you want to Moses and Elijah. They won't care. But they are not Jesus. He was and is and always will be the sun who shines. Don't warp him. Worship him. Do you see the point? He is sun-like. There's a beautiful thing about the sun, a beautiful thing about a fire. Light, warmth. But what's the point? If you get too close, or if you treat it casually, you will get burned. Jesus is burning sun. He is life and light to all he brings, but don't treat him casual. Don't lessen him to be anything like anything else in this creation. Our biggest need is to have a bigger view of Jesus. Doesn't matter if it's your addiction or your anger or your anxieties, your suffering or your sorrow or your sin. What we need is a bigger view of who Jesus is. Whoever we are, our understanding of what has happened at Christmas is way too small. The eternal Son veiled himself in human flesh. That is unlike anything else. Christmas is so fragile, isn't it? In terms of how most people treat it in our community. It is like a thin layer of wrapping paper and tinsel that is trying to cover up 364 days of emptiness and brokenness. And if you handle it too roughly, it will show how fragile it is. Jesus does the opposite to Christmas. Beneath a thin layer of human skin, there is an eternal weight of goodness and glory that is not fragile, but full. Full of life. To the point where your emptiness of life is replaced by an eternity of life that Moses and Elijah seem to be enjoying. They live even though they died. That's what Jesus brings. There'll be a lot of lights and glitter that try and get your attention this Christmas, but do not settle for a lesser light than this. The burning intensity of the glory of the Son of God. I think that's the point. Now we need to keep moving. Do you know what the beautiful thing about this room is? There's no clock in it. We can just forget about time. Shut up. Right, let's keep reading. This is the last thing. Verse 5. Peter made this suggestion, but it's met by God's interruption. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." We only hear directly from God the Father twice in Matthew's Gospel. One is back in chapter 3 when Jesus is baptized. He says, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." It can't be a good thing for Peter that the only other time you hear the Father's voice in this Gospel is to interrupt him. Peter must be way off if God the Father has to cut him off. But that's what happens. He shines in the brightness of a cloud to illuminate the identity of his Son even brighter. Peter, you have not got it yet. And so he speaks. My Son is not just a servant like Moses and Elijah. He is my Son, my beloved Son, my only Son. He is not just a servant like Moses and Elijah. He is the servant of whom the will of God will prosper in his hand, and God will say, "With him I am well pleased." So Peter, don't lower him, don't lessen him, don't liken him to anything else. His shining is meant to show his superiority. But the other thing, Peter, don't speak to him. Shut up long enough so that he can speak to you. Listen to him. His shining is meant to show that you are secondary. You ought to be submissive. I think that's a good thing for us to hear. I think a lot of my problems come from speaking too quickly and listening to Jesus too little. Or listening to everyone else too much and listening to Jesus too little. Isn't it striking? The only thing that God the Father says, apart from "This is my Son, whom I love, with him I am well pleased" in Matthew's Gospel, is these three words: listen to him. Now, we've seen that while Jesus shone, the disciples managed to stand. But when God the Father speaks, what happens to them? They shake and they fall. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. Now, there's a sense in which they fall down because that's just what people do before the voice of God in the Bible. When God speaks, people shake. But I think there's an added dimension here. I don't know if you'd agree with me, but I think that because they have devalued God's Son, they in some way realize that they have displeased the Father. There is definitely something of a interrupting, telling off in the voice of the Father to Peter saying, listen to him. But isn't it a beautiful thing that the one that they tell them, that the Father tells them to listen to, uses the first words they will hear to simply say, get up, do not be afraid. Do you see how Jesus is positioning himself here? You have God the Father and people who have displeased him, and Jesus stands in the middle and says, don't be afraid. That's the glory that shines from the top of this mountain. People who have displeased the Father, but Jesus in the middle saying, you do not need to be afraid because I am here. There'll be another mountain in Matthew's Gospel. It will be called Golgotha. It will not be bright, shining like the sun like this one. It will be deepest darkness. But do not think that his glory is absent from that dark mountain. The glory shines from Golgotha by Jesus taking that same position again. People who have displeased the Father, standing before the Father, now have a Son hanging on a cross in the middle so that he can say to those who have displeased the Father, get up. You do not need to be afraid. And if you're here today and you're not a Christian, and maybe you can't even explain why you're here, maybe today is God interrupting your life like he interrupted Peter to give you an important message that simply says, listen to Jesus. And the two things that you ought to do are tremble at the fact that you have displeased the Father, but then trust in the Son's words, do not be afraid. My hope is that this Christmas you experience what happens at the end of verse 8. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. That's what you need. All the razzmatazz of Christmas, all the distractions, all the other lesser lights gone. That you would see only Jesus.